Today, the name Porsche evokes images of wealth, luxury, and blistering speed. A brand that stands proudly among the world's most coveted automobiles, with revenues in the billions and a reputation for flawless engineering. The iconic crest of a black horse leaping forward is a global symbol of elegance and power. But behind the shimmering surface of this empire lies a truth far more disturbing. Few people know that Ferdinand Porsche, the man whose name defines the company, was once the favored engineer of Adolf Hitler. It was under Hitler's direct orders that Porsche developed the Volkswagen Beetle, a people's car that would later become one of the most successful vehicles in history. Yet behind its cheerful curves was a machinery of oppression factories that relied on forced labor, prisoners of war, and concentration camp detainees. The story of Porsche is one of contradictions. On one side, a genius engineer who revolutionized automotive design, introducing concepts decades ahead of his time. On the other, a man who tied his brilliance to one of history's darkest regimes, profiting from war and the suffering of innocence. And the paradox only deepens. For while Porsche cars today sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars to the world's elite, their origins are rooted in the mud and blood of the Second World War. After the fall of Nazi Germany, Ferdinand Porsche would not be celebrated as a hero, but dragged into the shadows, arrested, imprisoned, and forever scarred by his allegiance. This is not just the story of a luxury brand. It is the tale of a man who built an empire in the service of a dictator, paid the price for his choices, and left behind a legacy forever tainted by history. But how did Ferdinand Porsche, a poor boy from a small town in Bohemia, rise to become Hitler's trusted engineer? And how did that same name later transform into a symbol of luxury and prestige? The untold truth begins much earlier in the quiet streets of his childhood and family background. Ferdinand Porsche was born on the 3rd of September, 1875, in the small village of Maffersdorf, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in what is now the Czech Republic. His father, Anton Porsche, was a humble tinsmith who expected his son to inherit the family trade. His mother, Anna, managed the modest household, struggling to keep the family afloat. They were not wealthy, not influential, and certainly not destined to change the world. From the beginning, Ferdinand showed little interest in the life laid out for him. The noise of hammers in his father's workshop did not capture his imagination. Instead, it was the strange hum of electricity. As a boy, he secretly wired the family house with electric lights at a time when most homes in his village still relied on oil lamps. This single act revealed both his natural genius and his defiance of ordinary expectations. Yet life was not without hardship. The family's modest means meant that Ferdinand had no access to formal engineering education. Unlike the privileged elites who would go on to design the machines of the industrial age, Porsche was self-taught. Nights were spent studying electrical currents, gears, and engines by candlelight, scavenging knowledge wherever he could find it. His relentless curiosity became his greatest asset, but his passion often put him at odds with those around him. Local townspeople dismissed him as eccentric, a dreamer tinkering with machines no one understood. His father, frustrated that Ferdinand refused to focus on the family craft, often clashed with him. Still, young Ferdinand could not be swayed. His obsession with mechanics only grew stronger. There were early hints of the future legend he would become. By his teenage years, he had constructed rudimentary engines and experimented with vehicles that blurred the line between carriage and machine. He wasn't just fascinated by automobiles, he was consumed by them. Decades before cars would dominate the roads of Europe, the boy who refused to follow his father's path would soon carve out one of his own, propelled by equal parts genius and defiance. But as he left his small village in search of greater opportunities, Ferdinand Porsche carried with him both the weight of his humble origins and the burning ambition to prove the world wrong. That ambition would lead him to his first struggles, humiliations, and bitter failures, moments that would nearly destroy him before destiny placed him in the orbit of power. Early struggles and failures. When Ferdinand Porsche left his quiet village behind, he carried little more than his stubborn determination and a restless mind. Lacking a university education, he was immediately at a disadvantage in a world where diplomas often mattered more than raw talent. But Porsche was never one to accept limits. He took on work as an apprentice mechanic, moving from one modest workshop to another, always searching for a place where his ideas could breathe. In his early 20s, he joined Bela Egger and Company, an electrical company in Vienna. Here, he finally had access to real equipment and materials that allowed him to experiment. His colleagues quickly noticed his unusual drive. But while his inventions impressed a few, the wider establishment saw him as little more than an ambitious outsider. He had no formal qualifications, no prestigious mentors, only an endless appetite for engineering. His first real test came when he moved to Austro-Daimler in 1906, eventually rising to become their chief designer. This should have been his moment of triumph, but instead it became a trial of endurance. Porsche poured himself into designing racing cars, convinced that speed was the ultimate measure of innovation. He created powerful machines that dazzled on the racetrack, but inside the boardroom, skepticism grew. His ideas were often seen as too radical, too expensive, or too impractical for the average consumer. When his racing cars began to fail in competitions, critics dismissed him outright. Rivals whispered that he was reckless, a tinkerer with no real grasp of business. The humiliations piled up, projects canceled, investors turning cold, colleagues questioning his judgment. Yet perhaps the most painful blow came not from the outside world but from his own superiors. After years of service, Porsche was forced out of Austro-Daimler in 1923. For a man who had given his life to designing machines, the dismissal felt like betrayal. He left with no company, no title, and no security, just a reputation as a brilliant but unreliable dreamer. Even worse, his personal finances were in shambles. Supporting a family while chasing bold ideas had left him with debts. He struggled to keep himself afloat, moving from one position to another, including a brief stint at Daimler-Benz. Each role seemed to slip through his fingers. The world of automobiles was evolving rapidly, and Ferdinand Porsche risked being left behind. But in failure, Porsche discovered his resilience. Every rejection hardened his resolve. Every setback deepened his conviction. He refused to fade into obscurity. Instead, he began working as a consultant, founding his own design office in Stuttgart in 1931. It was here, surrounded by a small, loyal team, that he would finally begin to shape the ideas that would change history. What Porsche could not have known was that his darkest failures had set the stage for his most fateful alliance, an alliance with a rising political figure who promised him unlimited resources and power. That man's name was Adolf Hitler. Breakthrough and rise. By the early 1932nd, Ferdinand Porsche was no longer just an engineer chasing contracts. Through his Stuttgart design office, he had built a reputation as the man companies turned to when they wanted bold, unconventional ideas. He experimented with lightweight cars, streamlined bodies, and compact engines. Still, despite his brilliance, Porsche struggled to secure the kind of funding that could bring his visions to life. And then came the fateful encounter that would change everything. In 1933, Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany. The new chancellor was obsessed with transforming the nation not only politically, but technologically. He envisioned motorways crisscrossing the Reich, and alongside them, a car for every German family, cheap, reliable, and efficient. Most automobile companies dismissed the idea as impossible, but when Hitler met Ferdinand Porsche, he saw in him the perfect engineer to make this dream real. For Porsche, the opportunity was irresistible. Hitler granted him the resources he had long been denied: state funding, factories, and protection. In return, Porsche promised to build the Volkswagen, the people's car. The result was the Volkswagen Beetle. Its rounded shape, simple design, and affordable price would make it one of the most iconic vehicles of the 20th century. But in the 1932nd, it was more than just a car. It was propaganda on wheels, a symbol of Nazi Germany's promise of prosperity. Porsche had finally found his breakthrough, and his name was tied directly to Hitler's vision. At the same time, Porsche's engineering genius extended beyond civilian cars. Under Nazi patronage, he designed military vehicles, including the Kübelwagen and the fearsome Tiger tank. His work brought him fame, prestige, and immense influence within the Reich. To many Germans, Ferdinand Porsche was no longer just an engineer, he was the architect of the future of mobility. But while his professional rise was meteoric, it came at a heavy moral cost. The Volkswagen factories were built on the backs of forced labor, prisoners of war, foreign workers dragged into Germany, and detainees from concentration camps. Porsche's empire was growing, but it was built on suffering. Still, for the man who had once been dismissed and humiliated, this was the pinnacle. He had the ear of Hitler, the resources of the Nazi state, and a reputation as a visionary. The boy from Maffersdorf had not only proven himself, he had become one of the most powerful engineers in Europe. What he did not know was that this alliance with the regime would mark him forever. His triumph would carry within it the seeds of tragedy, because when the war ended and Hitler was gone, Ferdinand Porsche would be left alone to face the consequences of his choices: dark side, tragedy, and controversies. The war that had elevated Ferdinand Porsche to power would also drag his name into infamy. As Germany's defeat became inevitable in 1945, the empire he had built under Nazi patronage collapsed around him. The Volkswagen factories lay in ruins, bombed into twisted steel and ash. But the physical destruction was nothing compared to the stain on his reputation. For Allied investigators, Ferdinand Porsche was not merely a talented engineer, he was Hitler's chosen man. The Volkswagen Beetle, once hailed as the people's car, was now a chilling reminder of Nazi propaganda. Worse still, evidence emerged of forced labor. Tens of thousands of workers, men, women, and even children had been dragged from across Europe and forced into brutal conditions in Porsche's factories. Many never survived. When the war ended, Porsche could not escape the reckoning. In December 1945, he was arrested by French authorities, accused of war crimes and collaboration. Alongside his son Ferry and his son-in-law Anton Pieck, he was imprisoned in a grim facility outside Paris. For a man once celebrated as a genius, the fall was devastating. He was no longer an honored engineer but a disgraced figure, stripped of dignity, locked behind bars. Porsche's health, already fragile, deteriorated rapidly in prison. He suffered from strokes and heart trouble, yet the French demanded an enormous bail for his release. For 20 long months, he remained in custody, uncertain if he would ever be freed. His family scrambled desperately to raise funds, turning to allies in the industry and even negotiating with emerging automotive players. This was the darkest chapter of his life, the price of his choices, the weight of his alliance with Hitler. The man who had once stood beside dictators now languished as a prisoner, his name synonymous with shame. And yet, tragedy carried another twist. While Ferdinand Porsche struggled in captivity, his son Ferry quietly began rebuilding. He refocused the family's efforts on creating a sports car brand under their own name. By 1948, the first Porsche 356 was born, a sleek, elegant vehicle that signaled a new future. Ironically, it was the next generation that saved the Porsche name from oblivion, while the patriarch was still a broken man behind prison walls. In 1947, Ferdinand was finally released, but he never fully recovered. His body was weakened, his spirit scarred. He had achieved greatness, but at a terrible cost: complicity with one of history's darkest regimes, the suffering of thousands, and his own downfall. By the time of his death in 1951, Ferdinand Porsche remained a man of contradictions, hailed as a genius by some, condemned as a collaborator by others. His life was both a triumph of engineering and a tragedy of moral compromise. Legacy and present day. Today, Porsche stands as one of the most prestigious automobile brands in the world. Its cars are synonymous with elegance, performance, and innovation. From the timeless curves of the Porsche 911 to the cutting-edge engineering of modern supercars like the Taycan, the company commands billions in revenue and a fiercely loyal following across the globe. The crest of the rearing horse is no longer just a badge of German luxury, it is a global icon. Yet the legacy of Ferdinand Porsche remains complicated. On one hand, he was an undeniable genius, a man whose vision and technical brilliance transformed the automobile industry. His contributions to design and engineering reshaped mobility in the 20th century, leaving behind innovations that continue to influence the cars we drive today. But on the other hand, his story cannot be told without the shadow of history. His close collaboration with Adolf Hitler, his role in producing war machines, and the reliance on forced labor during World War II are stains that no amount of luxury or wealth can erase. They remain a chilling reminder that genius, when bound to power, can serve both creation and destruction. Perhaps the most striking part of this legacy is how the Porsche family managed to turn disgrace into triumph. Ferry Porsche's determination in the late 1942 ensured that the name Porsche would not disappear into infamy, but instead be reborn as a symbol of luxury and aspiration. The brand thrives today because of that reinvention, but the past still lingers beneath the polished surface. The story of Ferdinand Porsche is not just a story of a car company. It is the story of a man who reached unimaginable heights, only to fall into disgrace, and whose name now lives on in both triumph and tragedy. And so, every time a Porsche speeds down the highway, it carries with it two legacies, one of brilliance and innovation, the other of moral compromise and the shadows of history.